right, we're back in our study of Genesis. You open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 2. We're going to talk about a couple issues here in verse 4 when he uses the word generations as describing what God had just accomplished. And so we finally made it through all the days of God working within that earth and heaven that we found he created in Genesis 1:1. And we saw how he made everything perfect. He made everything very good for a specific creature he created, and that was man. And so we started here where we had here in the beginning, and as this timeline starts here, when God started to create, he created that first heaven and earth. And we went over all that, and how there was one heaven and one earth in the beginning, and how the angels were created back then. And then we saw how Satan fell. And Satan fell, and when Satan fell, God removed himself to the third heaven. He put a sea of glass there and a cloud and sealed it off from under here, and then he flooded this with water, destroying that heaven underneath and that earth that he had originally created. And that's the state of the earth we find in Genesis 1:2. It's underwater, and the heavens are just flooded. And he did all that in judgment against the rebellion of Satan. And then we saw how God then, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and on, in 6 days, we have the 6 days here where God works. And he works with that original heaven, and he works with that original earth, and he remolds them. He gives that earth form again, and he basically, he takes that, and he's still sealed off here, and he pushes that water out of the heaven that he had flooded with it back to the edges. He puts an atmosphere around the earth, and then he makes the earth good again. And he did all that so he could place man on the earth, okay? To subdue it, and to subdue that angelic rebellion that had taken place. And we've gone through all the days and what God did, and how he divided the waters on the earth until all the dry land up, and how he let the vegetation grow then, and how he made and then created some animals, and then how he made and then created man. And God looked back on the end of day 6 and says, everything's very good, because God's purpose, God's plan for redeeming, or for putting all that rebellion under his authority again through man is good. His plan is being fulfilled now. And so he does all that. And when we come to Genesis chapter 2, God's done. Verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And God's done working now. There's nothing more needed to be made, nothing more needed to be created. Everything is in place for God to bring back his creation to him through this agent of man that he created, that Jesus Christ was going to work through and work with to bring everything back to God that was ruined when Satan fell and the rebellion took place against him. And so God says in verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the hosts of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he hath rested from all his work which God created and made. And we've talked about that. There were some things God created, and then there were some things God made in this 6-day period that he is now resting from. So we find the earth here at the end of the 6 days in a very good state. But then he tells us in verse 4, these are the generations of the heavens and of the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. He uses the word generations. And that's what we're going to talk about for a couple of minutes here. He calls these are the generations, plural, of the heavens and of the earth. And that's an interesting word. God looks back at what he has made here, and he says, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth. And that's an interesting word that God uses, and He uses it for a purpose. And it's teaching us that this is a second generation that came out of the first generation of the heaven and the earth. Okay, a generation is when you have one, and then that produces a second. Okay? Now you can have a generation. And that's exactly how the Scriptures define generations. The word generations means there's been a parent that has produced an offspring, that has produced a second. A second has come out of the first. And we're going to see in a couple minutes, every time the word generations is used, it is used in that way. Turn over to Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. We know there was Adam. And Adam by himself, you cannot call a single entity generations, plural. Okay? We look at Adam in Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man in the likeness, and then you drop down to verse 3, and Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image, called his name Seth. And so you see here, when God talks about Adam, and He uses the word generations in regards to him, it's after Seth is born. Okay? You see Seth's born up in verse 26 of chapter 4. Actually verse 25. And Adam knew his wife again. She bare a son and called his name Seth. So you see the birth of Seth. And then in chapter 5, God can say, Adam has generations now, because Seth has been born after him. Okay? And this is going to help us understand that when God uses the word generations, when talking about the earth that we live in, it's the second generation from the original earth God created. Do we understand that? It's giving further proof to what we've been talking about, and how that in the beginning, God did some creating. He created an earth, and in that beginning, there was an earth, but the earth we live in today came out of that earth. It's the second generation of that earth. Okay, just like here. Turn over to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10. And we see him here again. Verse 1, talking about Noah. Noah has sons. These are the generations of the sons of Noah. Shem, Ham, Japheth, and unto them were the sons born after the flood. When God uses the word generations in regards to Noah, it's after his sons are born. You can't use the word generations when Noah didn't have any children, because it wouldn't make any sense. Generations always has to do with after the second has been produced. Genesis chapter 11, verse 10. Talking about Shem now. Shem has some kids. These are the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begat Arphaxad. How do you like to have that for a name? Boy, that's... Come here, Arphax, or however you would say that, 2 years after the flood. How do you think of a name like that? But Shem did. So, but again with Shem, the word generations is used with him when he has children. Okay, so now let's go back to Genesis chapter 2. And talk about this word generation relationship to the earth. What it's teaching us is that when God says in Generations chapter 2, verse 4, these are the generations of the heaven and the earth, that the heaven and the earth that we experience, that we see now, is the second generation. It came out of the first generation that God created in the beginning. Okay? This is just giving further proof to what we've been discussing, and how that back here in the beginning, you had the fall of Satan. And all that took place back there in the beginning. Okay? Because God could not use the word generations in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 here, if that was not the case. If this is the first earth and first heaven and the original everything, you couldn't use the word generations with it. So this might be nitpicky, and you might be like, oh great, but it's just giving further evidence and proof to what we've been saying and teaching about how everything happened. Now, one thing to note, the earth we live in is not a second earth. God didn't eliminate that earth and then create a new earth. God took that original earth that was destroyed and without form and void and reformed it. So it's not like we're in a second earth that was created. Okay? We're just in the second generation of that first earth that was destroyed, and God took that earth and reformed it and gave it shape. And the earth that we see now is that same earth from the beginning. It's just been reconstituted and reformed. Okay? And it's the same thing with the heaven. The heaven out there is the same heaven that was there. It's just been given different stuff in it. Looks different than it did in the beginning. Okay? So that's why it's called the generations. That's where we are. We're in the second generation of that earth. And we're going to talk in another lesson here so about a second earth that's going to come. And I'm going to touch on that for a couple minutes in the next lesson. But for now, we just need to see that. And one thing I did want to talk about for a second here, you know, people question, what about the fossils that you find in the earth? Well, I'll tell you, when God destroyed that earth, He destroyed everything. There's no remnants of that left over at all. The fossils we find in our earth are all from us, from the creation of Genesis 1-2 on. When God created the earth, there were, you know, people say, what about dinosaurs? Yeah, there were dinosaurs in the earth that Adam saw. And Adam was able to converse with. You know, when God talks to Job, He talks about some dinosaurs over there. And so, yes, there were dinosaurs here on this earth. And they were created fully grown. Just like all the other creation that was fully grown. And all the other animals that were created mature. All right? We don't have to worry about that. And then when they died, you know, and a lot of that fossilization happened with the flood, and we're not going to go into all the issues with that. But the fossils we find today are not remnants of this world. That world was complete. When God says the earth was without form and void, it was completely wiped clean by that flood He brought in. And, you know, fossils of like Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthal man, those are not, you know, pre-Adamic beings that lived over here that we haven't, no. Those are remnants of Adam's race. And, you know, there's a book that I read, Buried Alive. And this is an orthodontist who actually was able to go to France and work with the Neanderthal man skulls and things that they have. And, you know, what you see on display over there in places are usually replicas, cast models of the original. He worked with the original. And he went over there as an orthodontist to do some work about orthodontry, about teeth in these Neanderthals. And they let him in. And he took x-rays and got to handle a lot of these things. And then when they realized that he was a Christian, the French government actually hunted him down to try and take back all his x-rays to destroy them for what he had. And it's actually a really good book. It's called Buried Alive. Well, he was able to show, and the pictures are there, and he describes his flight out of France being chased by the police as they're trying to get all his equipment and everything, all the pictures he took. Well, he took the skulls, and you know, most Neanderthal skulls, you see the skull, and then the jaws jutted way forward, you know, and make it look, you know, ape-like or something. He realized that that's all wrong. The jaw fits perfectly where it should fit, and when you bring it back, it's exactly like man's features. And that what they show you on the modeling out there is all a lie. But either way, the fossil record is not a fossil record of a pre-Adam man. It's just a fossil record of man. And I'll tell you this, man looked different back in Adam's day. He was stronger, he was bigger, he was wiser, he was able to do things that we can't do today. Man's degenerating. we're devolving. We're weaker, we're not as smart, we don't see as well, and we can't do the things Adam did. And so you don't have to be worried about any of the fossil record that's found. You know, the dinosaur bones, yes, that's from the Garden of Eden and that type of vegetation. You know, when you actually think about it, it needed dinosaurs to control the vegetation, to eat it. But, so those things were here. So we live in the second generation of this, and we experience that, and that's why God uses that in verse 2 and verse 4 there, the generations of the heaven and the earth. So that just gives further proof to what we've had. So we're going to end it for this word. We're going to keep this one short, and we'll get into our next one here in a minute. All right, we'll talk to you in a little bit.